Welcome back, folks. I'm Frizz, and today we're going to be going over the second half of all of the cantrips on Pathfinder 2e. If you haven't checked out the previous part of this guide, then I really do recommend that you look at it. I won't be directly referencing that video in this one, but if you haven't seen it, then you won't see my takes on those cantrips, and it helps to get a bit of reference in how I actually view cantrips. Cantrips are very, very fun and super useful for spellcasters, which is a nice change of pace since previous systems. Without further ado, let's just jump right into things without having a super long drawn out intro. Let's start with Light. Light is a super basic cantrip that is very useful unless your party happens to all have dark vision. It takes 2 actions to cast, and then you touch a 1 bulk or less item, and it glows like a torch, until you either cast Light again, or you finish a long rest. This basically has the sole purpose of giving people who can't see in the dark some light, and it means they don't actually have to wield that item like a torch to be getting that light. So if you have a human barbarian in the party who uses a two-handed weapon, you can tap some part of their armor or a necklace or something like that to give them light, and then they don't have to use a hand to give themselves light. Whenever it gets heightened to 4th level, it gets way brighter than a torch, shedding bright light in a 60-foot area and dim light in a further 60 feet. Also, light can be used to dispel magical darkness, though you have to be right next to it or in it, which might be an issue for some spellcasters. Overall, light is very good. It's not a very flashy spell, but if you don't have it and you need it, you will really feel its absence. Mage Hand is a really nice spell for utility and roleplay, though it isn't all that useful in combat most of the time. It takes 2 actions to cast, and then you conjure an invisible or ghost-like hand that picks up an unintended object of light bulk. Whenever you sustain the spell, and once whenever you cast it, you can move that item 20 feet. As you heighten this spell, both the range and weight limit of the spell increase. While it isn't all that useful in combat because it has to be an unattended object, it is really fun to have minor telekinetic powers, and it can help you get up to all kinds of shenanigans. Another spell with somewhat limited combat utility, Message is, rather than being useful for combat, very useful for subterfuge and stealth. With a single action, you mouth some words, and a target within 120 feet of you hears you as if you were standing right next to them, but no one else hears it unless they are very good at reading lips or have just very good hearing. This spell is great for sending quiet messages or signals, and it being just one action makes it even better. Plus, it gets even better once you can heighten it to 3rd level, since its range then increases to 500 feet, which makes it a lot better. I do believe that you still have to see your target though, which does limit it somewhat, but it is still very nice for sending someone a quiet message or instructions in a situation where you really don't want to stand out. Continuing the theme of spells not having a lot of direct combat utility or damage, Prestidigitation is probably the first spell that any spellcaster learns, simply due to how much it would make your life easier. While Prestidigitation has 4 concrete uses that are explicitly stated out in the rules, the spell as a whole is best described as minor magical tricks. You just do minor feats of magical prowess, whether that is creating small but very obvious illusions, cleaning objects, or something as simple as knocking a cup off of the table. You can also use it to heat up food, flavor food, all kinds of just super minor stuff that you would imagine that magic would be used for, but doesn't have a full cantrip of its own to do. It basically has 0 combat utility, since it explicitly states that it cannot deal any damage or cause conditions. But what self-respecting spellcaster doesn't have this prepared or known? Seriously, with a job as dirty as adventuring, having the ability to clean yourself off anywhere at any time is a huge boon. Also, you can just mess with your friends by making their food taste like anything of your choice. which is a great excuse for causing chaos. Produce Flame is probably the most basic damaging cantrip. You make a spell attack, and if you hit, you deal 1d4 plus your spellcasting modifier, fire damage. If you critically hit, then you deal double that amount of damage, but you also do 1d4 persistent fire damage. For each level that it gets heightened, the base fire damage increases by 1d4, while the persistent fire damage also increases by 1d4. This is pretty good scaling for a cantrip, and at higher levels that persistent damage can become really scary. The one thing to keep in mind though is that the higher and higher level you get, the more likely you are going to be running into fire resistance, and fire is the most common element to have resistance to. So just keep that in mind if you're relying on this for a lot of your damage. Protect Companion is great for any character who has an Eidolon or a minion, but it is especially good for summoners. It only takes a single action, and it targets an Eidolon or minion, and then you give that ally a magical shield that gives them a +1 circumstance bonus to AC. Also, you can now use the life block reaction to reduce damage that target takes by 10, though you do end up taking 5 of that damage. If that damage ends up being reduced to 0, it still counts as a hit for other effects like poison. So if a snake bites your companion, you reduce the damage down to 0, they still have to roll fortitude saves against their venom. Also, once you use this reaction to reduce damage, the spell immediately ends and you cannot cast Protect Companion again for 10 minutes. For every 2 levels that the spell gets heightened, you can reduce the damage by another 10, though whenever you do so, you take another 5 damage. This is a great spell for a lot of characters, since it is basically just the shield cantrip for your allies. But it is straight up amazing for summoners, just due to how you share your health with your Eidolon. If you reduce the damage of your Eidolon takes by 10, then you take 5, you're basically just reducing the amount of damage that you took overall from the attack that you were already going to get damaged by 5, or by an additional 5 per 2 levels that it gets heightened. Shield is already a good spell, and this is just Shield, Eidolon, Shield Minion, so of course it's going to end up being good. Puff of Poison is an interesting cantrip that allows you to breathe out poisonous gas towards a creature within 5 feet. They take poison damage equal to your spellcasting modifier and 2 persistent poison damage. Of course, they also get a basic fortitude save versus the damage, which is expected for any damaging cantrip. For every 2 spell levels that it gets heightened, the damage increases by 1d8 and the persistent damage increases by 2. While I really do love the concept of this spell, I feel like the damage is a bit too low to justify the measly 5-foot range. I personally feel like this would have been a bit better if it was a cone effect rather than being a single target spell. In that case, the damage would have been appropriate and it would have matched pretty much every other cantrip that has this kind of damage spread. As it is though, Puff of Poison is a little bit underwhelming, but at least it has the distinction of having the single largest damage die of any cantrip. Ray of Frost is very similar to Produce Flame, except that it deals cold damage instead of fire. You deal 1d4 plus your spellcasting modifier cold damage to a creature, and if you critically succeed on your spell attack, then you deal double damage and give them a minus 10-foot status penalty to all of their speeds as they get covered in frost. This does only last for 1 round, but it can be really annoying for them to deal with. The really interesting element of this spell is its range. Most cantrips have a range of 30 feet, which means that you will only be 1 or 2 strides away from the thick of the fight at most times, which is pretty dangerous for most characters. Ray of Frost has the highest range of any damaging cantrip, with a whole 120 feet. That allows for you to plink away at targets from a really far distance, which is a great strategy even if the actual damage output of this cantrip isn't the best when compared to some other. Plus, if you actually do manage to get a critical hit on them, then they get slowed down, so it's even harder for them to approach you. Read Aura is similar to Detect Magic. but it does end up working slightly differently. It takes a full minute to cast, but once the casting time finishes, you can select one object within 30 feet, and then you learn if it's magical or not. If it is, then you also learn the School of Magic, which can give you some good hints at what it might do. If it's illusion magic, though, then you can't actually learn that that object is magical unless the item's spell level is lower than your read magic spell level. This won't come up nearly as often as it will with Detect Magic, though, as Detect Magic functions similarly, since most illusion effects that you'll be actually concerned about are tied to creatures rather than objects. So you won't run into invisible objects very much, but you're going to run into invisible creatures a hell of a lot. As the spell gets heightened, you can start to read the auras of more and more items at once. Once it gets heightened to 3rd level, you can read the aura of 10 items within one casting. And once it gets heightened to 6th level, then you can read the aura of everything within 30 feet. Overall, Read Aura is a great utility spell that shares an interesting role with Detect Magic. Since Detect Magic no longer tells you which item is magical, only which square the magic is in, you kind of need Read Aura to find that information if there isn't another way to tell. You can always do the kind of silly method of, oh, if I think this sword is magical, I'm just going to move around with this sword, casting Detect Magic until I'm sure that it's magical. But Read Aura is a much more streamlined way to figure out if a particular item is magical. The Read the Air cantrip is fascinating for the socially awkward spellcaster. It basically just adjusts how you act very slightly to better match the situation that you're in. It helps you figure out body language, or even just figure out what people are saying. It takes 2 actions, and then you can make a free recall knowledge with society about the situation that you're in. It might give you some information on the customs of the area or culture that you're in, or maybe just some words or phrases to avoid that might offend whoever you're talking to. Also, for 1 minute after you cast the spell, you get a +1 status bonus on any diplomacy checks that are made to make an impression with someone, due to all the little hints that the spell gives you. You can't keep casting the spell over and over and over again within the same situation, though, since the hints only help you the first time that you cast the spell. This is a super fun spell that completely lacks, like, actual use in most situations, but it's just a lot of fun. Who doesn't want to play, like, a really, really nervous bard who just relies on this for figuring out how to deal with situations? That sounds like a really fun character. Scatter Scree is a super interesting spell for both crowd control and damage. You choose 2 connected 5-foot cubes, and then you shoot out a bunch of earth and gravel into them. You deal 1d4 plus your spellcasting modifier bludgeoning damage to all creatures in those cubes. Of course, they get a basic reflex save to reduce the damage, but this is pretty good damage for the area that it will be affecting. The interesting part of this cantrip is that for the duration of 1 minute after the spell, those 5-foot cubes are now difficult terrain for anyone moving through them, which is some great utility for it just being a cantrip. Someone can always use 1 action to remove the rubble, but still, that is eating up an action from an enemy, which is going to be very useful. Also, for every level that it does get heightened, the damage increases by 1d4. All around, Scatter Scree is a fantastic cantrip that can give some great utility while not giving up any damage at all. Also, do keep in mind that the instant that you cast Scatter Scree again, the difficult terrain does go away. So if you're casting it every turn, then you aren't going to be creating a stupid amount of difficult terrain. That'd be a bit too good for a cantrip. Shield is a really fantastic single-action cantrip that you can use to really bolster your defenses as a spellcaster. As a single action, you make a magical shield of force that gives you a +1 circumstance bonus to your AC until the start of your next turn. This is already good, but you can also use this shield to use shield block, which basically just reduces the incoming damage by 5, and it immediately goes away. Once you do use shield block, though, you can't cast shield for 10 minutes, because the shield has to get itself back together. Also, since it's made out of force, you can actually use shield to shield block magic missile attacks, which normally you can't do, but because both of them are made out of force, you can actually block it. One of the big reasons why shield is so good is because of how it heightens. Every 2 levels that it gets heightened, the hardness of the shield whenever you use shield block increases by 5, meaning that at 9th level, or so whenever it's at 9th level, not whenever you are 9th level, you can block a whole 25 damage with one hit. It might not seem like all that much, but keep in mind that it's still just a cantrip, and even if you don't use shield block, you'll still be improving your AC the entire time. So this is a fantastic boost to your defensive abilities. Plus, it's a verbal only spell that doesn't trigger attacks of opportunities. And since it's verbal only, you can use this while using a two-handed weapon. Sigil is basically the graffiti spell, except that this graffiti is not very subtle and it always can be connected back to you. It has 2 actions: you touch an adjacent object or person, and then you put your magical mark wherever you touch. It lasts forever on objects, but it can always be removed with 5 minutes of scrubbing or washing. If it's on a creature, then it will naturally fade over the course of a week, unless it gets scrubbed off early. The interesting bit of Sigil is that it can either be visible or invisible, and it can change between the two simply by the caster touching it with a single interact action. This can make for some interesting subterfuge, or just some really obnoxious proper data facing. Imagine casting See Invisibility, then discovering that you've actually had a sigil on your forehead for the past 2 weeks. As the spell gets heightened, it can get more and more annoying when it's specifically casted on people. Once it gets heightened to 3rd level, it lasts for a full month instead of a week on a person, or until it gets scrubbed off, and at 5th level it increases to a full year. Once you can cast 7th level spells, your mark now lasts forever, or until it gets washed off. Sigil is a very fun spell, with actually no uses baked directly into the spell, but in creative hands you can really get some fun uses out of it. Spout is an incredibly simple damaging cantrip. You choose a single 5-foot cube within 30 feet, and then a burst of water shoots up through it, dealing 1d4 plus your spellcasting modifier and bludgeoning damage to everyone inside. They, of course, get a basic reflex save like normal for spells like these, but the interesting part is that the area can actually be increased to a 5-foot burst rather than a 5-foot cube if you center the spell on a body of water. This has to be a decently sized body of water, meaning that you can't use it on stuff like puddles or just glasses of water, but it is a really fun, flavorful ability, especially if you're going to be in an aquatic environment. Additionally, every single level that it gets heightened, the damage increases by 1d4, which is pretty good, damage increases for a cantrip that is an area effect. While it might be hard to get multiple creatures in a single 5-foot cube, if you're fighting against a swarm, or, a bunch of tiny-sized creatures that go inside of someone's square, you can really make that work. Well, it might not be a super mechanically powerful cantrip when compared to something, because generally reflex saves are going to be pretty good. It's great for characters that want to have a lot of water-based abilities, because there really aren't a whole lot of those. And it's not bad, it's just not the most efficient one, because that's always going to be Electric Arc. Stabilize is probably one of the most simple cantrips in the entire game. You choose someone within 30 feet who has the dying condition. They are no longer dying now. They are stabilized, don't have the dying condition, they probably gained the wounded condition, the normal stuff. It's very simple, and it can help out someone who has a super bad luck on their flat checks to see whether or not they continue to die. It's great if you don't have another way to heal them to get them back in the fight, and the next best thing, if you can't heal them, is to stabilize them, so they don't bleed out on the floor. Stabilize is super simple, and there's not much else to talk about here. You might save someone's character with it, and otherwise it's just a nice insurance policy. Summon Instrument is another one of those cantrips that, while you technically don't need to be efficient, in actuality you do kind of need it to be cool. You can use 2 actions and summon a handheld instrument. What a handheld instrument is pretty much just up to your GM. Only you can play it, and it sticks around for a whole hour. Once you can heighten this to level 5, it gets even better, since the instrument becomes a virtuoso instrument, giving you a +1 item bonus on your performance checks while using it. This is obviously a ton of fun, since you can always have an instrument on hand, and you can also just whip out literally any instrument that your GM allows for any joke that you can think of. Just imagine it. You can have a tuba whenever you want, since those are technically handheld instruments. That is just a really fun kind of feat for just messing around with your friends playing D&D or Pathfinder. Tame is a spell for people who really don't like hurting animals in games. It's similar to Charm Person, but it only works on non-hostile domesticated animals. This means that if it's attacking you, Tame most likely is not going to work, because that means that they are hostile, not unfriendly. This will work on unfriendly animals, but not animals who are currently trying to rip you a new one. You make a bunch of comforting sounds and slowly approach an animal within 10 feet that now has to make a will save against your enchantment. On a failure, they improve their attitude to you by 1 for 1 minute. At 3rd level, this becomes 10 minutes, while at 6th level, it becomes a whole hour. This can be really useful for calming down watchdogs, or for just letting that street cat trust you enough so you can get some bedtime. It's a really fun, really cute spell, and the best use of mind-altering magic that I can think of. Tanglefoot is the only cantrip that requires a spell attack roll that deals literally 0 damage. You create a super sticky vine, and you reach out and try and wrap up a creature's limbs that they use to move. So, for most things, that's gonna be legs. If you hit, they take a -10-foot penalty to all of their speeds until they spend an action to try and escape against your spell DC, or a round passes. If you critically hit them, then they are now immobilized for a round in addition to those speed penalties. They can still try and escape, but that's still going to eat up their actions. If used correctly, then this can really reduce a creature's actions and mobility, and just really be super annoying. Plus, it gets so much better as it gets heightened. Once it gets heightened to 2nd level, the effects last for a whole 2 rounds instead of 1, meaning that creatures are much more likely to have to use escape to be able to contribute well into the combat. Finally, if you heighten it to level 4, then the effects last for a whole minute, which basically ensures they will use an action to escape, rather than having to deal with the speed penalty or being immobilized. So Tanglefoot is great for locking down enemies and forcing them to use their actions to be able to contribute meaningfully. Telekinetic Projectile is the last damaging cantrip that we're covering today, and it will also be the simplest one yet. You hurl an object of 1 bulk or less at a creature within 30 feet, dealing 1d4 plus your spellcasting modifier in damage. The damage type depends on the object that you hurled, so a longsword might do slashing or piercing damage, depending on how you throw it, but a brick is going to be doing bludgeoning damage. Sadly, any magical properties of the item don't carry over, so a greater striking longsword is not going to be doing any more damage than a normal longsword would whenever it's being hurled. The only way to improve this is to heighten the spell, where it gets 1d6 additional damage every single time that it gets heightened. There are a ton of different fun uses for this spell. You can find some great ways to do some fun stuff with it if you're creative. Also, I was a bit confused on this for a little while, so I'm just going to include this in here. You count cover from your position rather than from the original object's position. So basically, if you try and shoot something from a table, it doesn't actually come from the table. First the object comes to you, and then it goes to the creature. So you can't use this to shoot around corners. Wash Your Luck is a pretty funny spell that can be situationally useful. For 2 actions, you do some kind of action that settles your thoughts, or makes you think that you're getting good luck, like adjusting how you're sitting at a table, or saying a quick prayer and grabbing a holy symbol, or just, rubbing a lucky button. Once in the next minute, you can then cancel out a single misfortune effect, just like how normal fortune effects work. Once that happens, you cannot cast Wash Your Luck for another minute. This is useful if you know they're going to be running into a lot of misfortune effects, because then it can be pretty useful because misfortune effects are really, really bad. But it can also just be in character for a superstitious gambler to try and cast Wash Your Luck before they say roll some dice, because you gotta make sure that your dice aren't unlucky. And here we are, finally at the end of all of the different cantrips. I can't wait for Paizo to release a whole nother set of like 30 of these things, so then I have to make another one of these. But to continue my thoughts from the last part of this guide, I absolutely adore cantrips in this system. They're super flavorful and super interesting, and there are tons of them that have no use in combat, that make complete sense in the day-to-day life of Valerian. For example, Wash Your Luck, like we just went over, doesn't really find a whole lot of use in combat, but of course, like a cleric of Desna would pray to their god for, hey, I've been getting pretty bad at gambling pretty recently, and I think that there's some magic behind it. Can you give me something to help him fix that? So then you get Wash Your Luck. All of these have some great utility and make a lot of sense in the narrative of the game, which I love. The one issue that I do have is that there are so many damaging cantrips that are only available to arcane or primal spellcasters because they're tied to manipulating elements. And while this does make sense, because, you know, a lot of divine elements and occult elements of spellcasting just don't manipulate elements, it's more about manipulating the spirit and the soul and all that. It does mean that there is a bit of a gap there. The Secrets of Magic definitely introduce a lot of damaging cantrips that are available to divine spellcasters, so it's not as much of a problem anymore. But there is a distinct gap. Despite that little gripe, I still love cantrips, and I feel like they make spellcasters so much more interesting than they were in previous editions, because now your wizard is never going to pull out a crossbow because their cantrips are so worthless that they never will cast them anyway whenever they run out of spells. Thanks for watching. This has been a really fun video to actually make and get out, and I hope that you've learned something. I've been working on this one for a while now, and since we've hit 200 subscribers while working on this, it's been really, really wild. I haven't expected to hit that at all whenever I started, so genuinely thank you. If you like what I've been putting out, then subscribing and liking the video are legitimately huge helps, since it boosts my channel in the YouTube algorithm, and it lets me know what you guys like. Also, commenting is the best way to actually let me know what you want me to see me change about my videos, what you think I'm doing right with them, or any other suggestions that you have. Until I see you next, live a wonderful life.